Good morning and welcome to Springville Senior Center's Mystery Murder Monday. Today we're going to be talking about 7 terrifying historical figures. The first one is Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler. Vlad III Dracula, better known by the gruesome moniker Vlad the Impaler, was a 15th century ruler of Wallachia, now part of Romania, who became notorious for his rampant use of torture, mutilation, and mass murder. Vlad's military exploits saw him praised by many as a hero, but his unmatched cruelty and penchant for barbaric executions, often against his own people, contributed to his reputation as one of history's most cold-blooded leaders. Now, Vlad's victims were supposedly killed through unspeakable means, including disembowelment, beheading, and even being skinned or boiled alive. Still, his preferred method was impalement, a grisly process in which the victim would had a wooden stake slowly driven to their body before being left to die of exposure. After one famous military victory against the advancing Ottoman Turks, Vlad supposedly had around 20,000 men impaled on the banks of the Danube. When the second wave of invaders arrived, they are said to have immediately retreated upon seeing the grotesque forest of corpses. According to some accounts, Vlad enjoyed dining among the thousands of impaled bodies and would even dip his bread into the blood of his victims. Now, this bizarre practice, along with the name Dracula and Vlad's birthplace of Transylvania, would later partly inspire the vampire in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. Now we move on to number 2 of our terrifying historical figures, and that is Rasputin. Rasputin. Much of Grigor Rasputin's life is shrouded in a myth, but history paints the picture of a mad monk. That's what they called him, a mad monk, who steered Russia towards chaos. Rasputin began his career as a populous holy man and was known to preach a religious doctrine arguing that true salvation was only possible through indulgence in sin. Now, his reputation as a faith healer eventually saw him summoned to the court of Tsar Nicholas II, where he ingratiated himself to Caesarea Alexandra Fedorovia after helping her hemorrhagic son recover from an injury. By 1911, Rasputin had secured himself a place in the Tsar's closest advisor. He then began using his influence to appoint incompetent and crooked officials while also indulging in drink and very perverse sexual appetites. Now, Rasputin had a con man's charm and reportedly took delight in humiliating high society women by making them lick his dirty fingers after he had dipped them in soup. He was accused of raping a nun and known to consort with prostitutes by night, even as he advised the Caesarea of state policy by day. Fearing that the wide-eyed sorcerer was leading Russia toward disaster, in 1916 a group of aristocratic conspirators poisoned him with cyanide. When the toxin failed to have its desired effect, the men reportedly shot him numerous times, then beat him up before dumping his body in the freezing Nevia River. Now, those gunshots didn't kill him. The freezing river is what killed him. Rasputin's death ultimately came too late to save the royal family from public disgrace. The Tsar, the Tsarina, and their 5 children were all murdered in 1918 during the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, also interestingly, during this time, he helped her hemorrhagic child numerous times of the Romanov family. And then also, there are some museums that have some of his stuff on display that you can see. There's a lot of weird tales. They cut his body up into multiple pieces and spread it out across everywhere, and some of his body parts supposed to be in the museum because of his treachery and his very evil, diabolical consorting with prostitutes and everything. They have some of those parts supposedly in the museum as well. His daughter, interestingly, was just as famous almost as he was. She was a circus performer, one of his two daughters. He had two daughters and a son. And some of his descendants, his great-great-grandchildren, are still alive. So if that's something you're interested in, by all means, look that up. Now we are moving on to our third. And our third vicious murderer, villain, is H.H. Holmes. H.H. Holmes was born Herbert Herman W. Muggett. The notorious serial killer H.H. Holmes spent his early career as an insurance scammer before moving to Illinois in advance of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Now, it was that Holmes built what he referred to as his castle, a three-story inn that he secretly turned into a macabre torture chamber. Some rooms were equipped with hidden peepholes, gas lines, trap doors, and soundproof padding, while others featured secret passages, ladders, and hallways that led to dead ends. There was also a greased chute that led to the basement, where Holmes had installed a surgical table, a furnace, and even a medieval rack. Both before and during the World's Fair, Holmes led many victims, mostly young women, to his lair, only to asphyxiate them with poison gas and take them to his basement for horrific experiments. He then either disposed of the bodies in his furnace or skinned them and sold the skeletons to medical schools. Now, Holmes was eventually convicted of the murders of at least 4 people, but he confessed to at least 27 more killings before being hung in 1896. Holmes' Horror Castle was later turned into a grotesque museum, but the building burned down before it could even be opened. And I'm pretty sure somebody set that place on fire to get rid of it. Number 4, we're looking at Elizabeth Bathory, often called the Blood Countess. Now, Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman who is widely considered to be history's most deranged female serial killer. Throughout the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Bathory was reportedly luring young peasants to her castle with promises of high-paying jobs as servants. Once trapped in the citadel, these victims were subject to unspeakable tortures. Some were beaten or stabbed with needles, while others were stripped naked and left to freeze in the snow. According to legend, Bathory even bathed in the blood of her virgin victims, believing it would keep her skin radiant and youthful. Elizabeth was allegedly massacred as many as 80 peasant girls, though the number may be as high as 600. But it was only when she turned her attention to her young noblewoman that she was finally stopped. In 1611, she was bricked up inside her castle chambers with only a small opening for food. She would die 4 years later in 1614. Some historians have since argued that Elizabeth Bathory was framed by political enemies. Tongue twister. While this claim is disputed, there is very little doubt that her reputation had become thoroughly entwined with myth and legend. Along with Vlad the Impaler, she is said to be one of the historical influences also behind Dracula. Now, number 5. We've all heard of this one. Jack the Ripper. In 1888, London's Whitechapel district was gripped by reports, y'all, of a vicious serial killer stalking the city streets. The unidentified madman was known to lure prostitutes into the darkened squares and side streets before slitting their throats and sadistically mutilating their bodies with a carving knife. Between August and November, 5 streetwalkers were found butchered in the downtrodden East End district, sparking a media frenzy and citywide manhunt. While he was originally known simply as the Whitechapel Murderer, the killer soon earned the chilling new name Jack the Ripper. Without modern forensic techniques, Victorian police were at a loss in investigating the Ripper's heinous crimes. Witnesses' testimonies were often contradictory, and after taking his final victim on November the 9th, the killer seemed to disappear like a ghost. The case was finally closed in 1892, but Jack the Ripper has remained an enduring source of fascination. The most popular theory suggests that the killer's understanding of anatomy and vivisection mean he was possibly a butcher or a surgeon. A lot of people lean more toward butcher. Over 100 possible suspects have been proposed, and the term ripperology has even been coined to describe the extensive study the cases receive. I do believe that he either passed away or had some kind of death, and that's why the murder stopped. But if you want to learn more about Jack the Ripper, I encourage you to look that up as well, like any of these. Excuse me. Number 6, Jacques de Reyes. I hope I'm not butchering that name. Jacques de Reyes was a 15th century French nobleman. He was a soldier and companion in the arms of Joan of Arc during the 100 Years' War. Reyes' military career earned him many plaudits, but his distinguished reputation and opulent lifestyle hid a horrific dark side that included charges of Satanism, rape, and murder. Beginning in the 1430s, he reportedly began torturing and brutalizing and killing young children, many of them peasant boys who had come to his castle to work as pages. After molesting his servants, he would murder them by cutting their throats and breaking their necks with a club. Others were decapitated and dismembered, and he was even known to kiss the severed heads of some of his victims. Pretty freaky person. He indulged in these sadistic habits unchecked until 1440, when he attacked a priest over a land dispute. This drew the ire of the church, which launched an investigation and soon uncovered his history of depravity. A famous trial ensued in which Reyes was charged with murder and sodomy and accused of practicing alchemy and other satanic rituals. He eventually confessed under torture to have murdered as many as 140 children, though some have claimed the number may be much higher, and he was hanged to death and then burned in October of 1440. They were not playing around by any means. Some historians have since suggested that he was the influence of the 17th century folktale Bluebeard, which follows a wealthy baron who murders his young wives. So if you're interested in that, check that out as well. Look up Bluebeards. And then last but not least, we have Tomas de Torquemada. Tomas de Torquemada. From 1483 to 1498, he presided over the Spanish Inquisition, the notorious Catholic tribunal used to try heretics and non-believers. In order to force their confession, these victims were subjected to gruesome punishments, including strangulation or being stretched on a rack. Others were waterboarded or put through strappito, a grueling torture in which subjects were hung by their wrists until their arms became dislocated. He was a Franciscan monk, and he was the man responsible for reorganizing the Inquisition, of expanding its scope to include crimes like blasphemy, usury, and even sorcery. He also ordered the expulsion of thousands of Jews, Muslims, and blacks, all of whom he believed would taint the spirit purity of Spain. Those that converted to Christianity were allowed to remain, but risked being tortured and executed by him if they tried to practice their faith in secret. All told, some 2,000 people were murdered during his reign as Grand Inquisitor, most of them beheaded or burned at the stake. So if you want to look up some more information on these 7 terrifying historical figures, you can check out my reference at history.com. You can also check out, just typing in their names. There is a plethora of information out there on all 7 of these. Again, Tomas de Torquemada, Jacques de Reyes, Jack the Ripper, Elizabeth Bathory, H. Holmes, Rasputin, and last but not least, Vlad the Impaler. So I recommend, if you're interested in those 7 terrifying historical figures, check them out. Evil creatures. And I hope you have enjoyed this segment of Murder Mystery Monday, and we will catch you next week. Y'all have a wonderful, wonderful week.